Well, good afternoon. My name is Nigel Cameron. It's a great treat to be here. I'm so grateful to David Kim, to Redeemer, to CF for inviting me. As you adjust to my version of an American accent, I'll tell you a story. We moved over here 26 years ago, nearly, and the most memorable encounter I had during my first couple of weeks in this country was at a supermarket. And there was a young woman at the checkout who was being very friendly and affable, as American people tend to be in these situations. Of course, in Britain, they all talk to each other and ignore you. I mean, service is a great American thing. And she was chatting with me, and she could tell I didn't quite belong. And so she said, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland. I'm British. She said, how long have you been here? I said, oh, only about a week. She said, your English is very good. Well, you know, I have to say, I am rarely at a loss for words, but I was. A couple things about really where I'm coming from, aside from Edinburgh and Scotland. One is you've got a version of my professional resume. A couple of things that aren't typically there because they're a bit more in the past. I actually began life as a Presbyterian minister. So this is a very congenial environment for me here in Redeemer. In Scotland, which, as you may know, is the fount of the global Presbyterian tradition. So I bear a certain, pride and proprietary sort of view of my origins. So my initial qualifications were in religion and philosophy and so on. And then early on, I give this story partly working with an audience like this, which obviously is largely a faith audience, but the younger people thinking about careers and transitions and so on. So that's really how I started up. And then I got interested in bioethics. Bioethics was pretty hot back then. It was new back in the late 70s, the early 80s. And I thought, here is an area where really Christians could be taking something of a lead because we thought through what it means to be human and so on. And all these technologies are unfolding around us. And as I have often said to students since, actually the shortest distance between the classroom and the television studio is the word bioethics, and that remains the case. So I got into bioethics, and then probably, around 15, 16 years ago, having mainly been focused there, although I also taught systematic theology, I ran a PhD program at a seminary, and this is all part of one block of my life, I decided that partly that the religious world was really not particularly interested in these questions, sad to say, and, parce this encounter this weekend, which is pretty unusual, and also, I decided that if you really want to influence the way in which decisions are being made about the values in technology, quite the best way to do this is not to say you're going to discuss ethics. It is saying you're going to discuss policy. And if you have discussions about policy and technology, you get not ethicists coming to your meetings, you get, if you like, grown-ups. I mean, you get policymakers, but you also get investors, people in the capital markets, which are much more important in the long term, I suspect, for shaping technology than policymakers themselves. Because ultimately, every conversation you have about the juxtaposition of policy, investment, technology, entrepreneurship is a discussion about values. And so I essentially began to rebrand myself. I got an MBA, which interestingly means people don't ask me now what my PhD is in. Interesting piece of, well, do a little marketing, you understand these things. And have been making efforts to convene conversations. So, I mean, what I now do is I run a think tank in Washington, D.C., a secular, non-partisan effort with some very distinguished participants. For example, the former head of the World Bank's corporate strategy, former president of the Council of Scientific Society presidents, some distinguished individuals coming together. And our concern, if you like, is twofold in the Washington context. It's with the significance of issues raised by emerging technologies and with their long-term impacts. And in Washington, of course, long-term is typically 18 months to 2 years. And this is where the money goes. And in the nature of the case, and perhaps somewhat counterintuitively, the more rapidly things are changing, the more significant becomes long-term thinking. Things are changing very slowly. You're talking about technology back in 1800. didn't greatly matter to think long term. Things are changing fast, it's more difficult, but it's more central. So, last fall I had 3 interesting conferences. One of which was to an economist conference in Hong Kong to speak about robots destroying jobs, which I've got a book coming out about, and believe me, they're going to destroy jobs. That's sort of privileged information against the conventional wisdom. Second trip was to GITEX. Some of you may know this is the Gulf Technology Conference in Dubai, which I was asked to moderate. But the third conference was the most interesting of all. I find conferences tend to cluster, you know, and this particular cluster was a sort of secular public cluster. I've got a Christian cluster at the moment. And the third was to Portugal. And it was an invitation from the former president of Brazil, who chairs a foundation called the Champalimaud Foundation, which is basically a science research foundation based in Lisbon, in Brazil. And they had this extraordinary conference on what the world would be like in 100 years' time. And it was a fascinating invitation to get, and it was rather beguiling the way the invitation letter was framed. Because President Cardoso said, a child born today may well be alive in 100 years' time. So this is not simply a theoretical conversation about a far distant future. And I actually had 3 new grandsons born in the previous year. So I was there were many reasons why I accepted this invitation. And I talked about my grandchildren at the conference. And at that event, I led off by saying, well, we have all these speculative speeches about the future 100. And I said probably the most useful thing we can be doing here is sharing the assumptions we are bringing to this conversation. And so I laid out several assumptions that I was bringing to it. I sense a trading assumption seems to me one of the most useful ways in which we can pool our wisdom about the future, particularly the more distant future. And so the panel that I was on, the section of the conference, is called Tools for the Future. And that phrase also has been in my head since. And since what I would like to offer you this afternoon, I'm going to share 4 tools, if you like. Huge amounts of information out there, endless amounts of data. It seems to me we need heuristics, you know, we need sort of tricks which will help us understand things which are new and which we were quite unaware of before we came across them. So I'm going to give you four broad concerns which I think may enable us to think better. Certainly they help me think better about what's going to happen in this whole realm of technology and the human thing. And the first of them, which I shared at the Champalimaud conference, was what I called non-naive optimism. The need for us to adopt as a methodological principle non-naive optimism. Now, of course, as you know, the closer you get to Silicon Valley, the closer you get to what one might regard as naive optimism. Technology solving all problems, you know, you've got the unicorns there, dozens of them now, enormous amounts of money in going into all of this stuff. And much of it is very wonderful, and I like these people, and I go out there and have fun with these people. But, point is, certainly you don't get a lot of non-naive thinking. And so, as a methodological principle, it seems to me we need to be optimistic. Because if you like the other side, the people who write books critical of the Valley, and critical of these technologies, again, they write very interesting things, and I agree with a lot of it. In fact, the last time I was here in New York, actually, I was speaking at a WorkTech conference. WorkTech is a very interesting organization that does conferences that bring together people from different disciplines on the future of work. And I was actually speaking after Sherry Turkle, and I admire her work, and I've been very pleased to meet her on 1 or 2 occasions. But people write negative books about technology, and there's a whole lot of these books, and they're all very interesting. Andrew Keen, Jaron Lanier, so on and so forth. But they are the pessimists, no question. I think as a methodological principle, particularly those of us who happen to be Christians, as many of us are, have grounds to approach the future, and if you like, have a risk-based need to approach the future in non-naive optimistic terms. So, that's my first offering. Secondly, as we've been talking about Moore's law. Now, no question. Second principle is, I think we need to embrace the rapidity of change. And we are going to find this harder and harder. Some of you, of course, know, Future Shock, Toffler's book from 1970 or so, which seems so quaint now. I mean, he was worried about the pace of change in 1970. I mean, as you will know, all these marvelous numbers out there, but that was when we were man on the moon before 1970, when the illustration is always being given that our devices now, I think the current term is they are 1 million times more powerful than NASA's computers were in 1969. But now really change is ramping up, and it is ramping up extraordinarily fast. And it does no good to pretend that it's not going to be extraordinarily disruptive. The issue of robots and jobs, I think, is one among many, many examples of this. But we have, and even in the technology community, among some of our tech leaders, I think we have a way of adopting, if you like, a fallacy of the new normal. We normalize all these, you look back, we see this exponential curve, all of these technologies, all of these apps and so on, and we assume this is the package that will take us forward. Whereas, of course, the disruptive principle it's going to get steeper and steeper. Now, Moore's law, of course, it's really quite complicated. It probably is ending, certainly in its silicon version, but we're talking about quantum computing, about biological, all kinds of other things. No question. There's going to be a continued exponential push here at the computational end. And then, of course, we look at the implications of some of these things. Now, Ray Kurzweil was mentioned. We had this little homage to Kurzweil, which I must say I enjoyed. I think I assumed that it was at least intended to be somewhat of an ironic sort of homage. I think Kurzweil basically is rather kooky. I mean, I think he's a very smart man. He's a very nice man. I've met him once or twice. He's been quite good at predicting a lot of technology stuff. But, for example, Gordon Moore does not believe in the singularity projection. I mean, Gordon Moore as in eponymous Moore's law, Gordon Moore. So, let's knock that brick out from under the pile. Kurzweil also believes that by 2029, we shall become immortal. I mean, Google it, I'm not making this up. He believes that by 2029, rather than 2030 or 28, the advances in I wish I were making it up. The advances in medical science would be such that every year we will be adding another year to life expectancy. And not for those being born afresh, but for those who are alive then. So make it for the next 13 years, and you're in. He also, of course, believes in extreme caloric restriction, which actually I think is a somewhat passé way now of looking at longevity. He also takes around 200 pills a day. And there's now serious evidence that for reasons we don't quite understand, you take a lot of vitamins and you live shorter, not longer. But that's Ray Kurzweil. But I think, and one thing I said to him when I met him out at one of his conferences, he used to have a lot of conferences. In fact, he had one at the Y, 92nd Y, some years ago. I said, you do realize, I think you are discrediting the conversation about the disruptive impacts of Moore's law by, as it were, branding it as the singularity discussion. And I said, I think that is a dangerous thing to have done, sir. It was over wine. It was very pleasant. But that would be part of my take on the Kurzweil phenomenon. This progression is really quite dramatic and disruptive in ways, of course, that we can't plan and prepare for. But we do know that the new normal is a fallacy. And we do know that these changes are going to cause huge pain as well as huge promise. And we have to be far more far-sighted about their potential implications. And the employment robotics thing, I've got a book coming out about this. So, in fact, I did a TEDx down in Brazil about this, if you want to Google some more and get some numbers out of me. It's pretty scary. Third input here, third tool. We need to prepare ourselves and to be uncomfortable by the contexts in which we address these issues moving forward, and specifically the context of space and of time. It really interests me, partly because of the biblical narratives, partly because, Archbishop Usher, doing all the math back then and saying 4004. If you've got an old King James version, it will still give that 4004 for the creation. And partly because, we're living here in 2016, the time involved in our Christian or even our Judeo-Christian or Islamic frame of reference is quite limited. And of course, humans haven't been around very long. Whether 4004 or, whether you take a more, standard view. I mean, this is tens, hundreds, thousands of years, depending on what you count human. Going forward, seems to me we have to frame this in terms of perhaps 1 billion years. And if our non-naive optimism is justified, the human race may be around for 1 billion years. It may be 1 billion years before God determines to wind up the present order and move from the Anthropocene, which is, now the term of art for this geological age that humans have dominated, into the Theocene, which may come next. It may be 1 billion years. And it seems to me this needs to help to shape the way in which we look at the openness of the future and the fact that we're not going to cap the well and keep this technology under control, in the next decade. This thing is going to keep gushing. And space. And of course, we have discovered now all of these planets which have potential for human life or non-human for organic life. Some of you who thought a bit about this issue of other intelligences will know the term the Fermi paradox, the Italian physicist Fermi, who said a long time ago that it was a paradox, that there ought to be, in principle, other civilizations billions of years older than our civilization out there in the history of the cosmos, but they haven't contacted us and we can't find them, and why not? Well, there's a book been out recently, new edition recently, with a foreword by Martin Rees, who's one of the world's great cosmologists. He was talking about this in Cambridge at a conference on this question recently. And he said the first edition of the book had 55 arguments against the Fermi paradox. He said the new edition has 75. We need to anticipate the existence of highly developed other intelligences within the universe. Space and time need to be open in ways we really have not been, either as a civilization, as a culture, or not least as a religious tradition, as we think about our future. And fourthly, well, let's be optimistic. Let's be candid about the pace of change, disruptive pace of change. Let's be open to the context of space and of time, but also for those of us who are here as Christians and those others who wish to take the Christian tradition as a starting point. Let's be theological. And not least, and this is one of the reasons I got into bioethics in the first place back 30, 35 years ago. It seemed to me that within our theological frame of reference, we had some sort of tools within which to understand the impact, significance, and our responsibility to these new emerging technologies. Because, of course, and this has been referenced, we have the creation of human beings in the image of God, and human beings given dominion, given command responsibility for this creation. Obviously, initially in agricultural and fishery terms, but as things have developed within the noosphere, within the intellectual capacities, which have enabled us to go from tools like wheels and adzes to tools like our devices, this, if you like, Moore's law is being ridden by the dominion mandate. And we need to think theologically about the significance of that question. I was actually recently asked to write a piece about, there's the new Elsevier encyclopedia coming out, save up your pennies for this, 5 volumes, the Encyclopedia of the Anthropocene, being the new term of art, which is all being discussed as when does it begin, when did humans really begin to impact the planet as such, on Christianity and the Anthropocene. So I'm sure this will be the top read article in the encyclopedia once it comes out. But what is so interesting is that for Christians, God set this thing up in the first place for us to have this fundamental relationship with his creation. And whether you want to talk about original sin, or whether he wants to talk about the dominion mandate. We have, if you like, concrete structures in place in our intellectual life, which are indeed up to the task of the broad categories in which we encompass the globe, and we think about the role of technology, and we think about its role in relation to human beings and human nature. But, of course, as we know, the human beings to whom this responsibility was given were made in the divine image. And in this somewhat mysterious biblical phrase, very concrete term in the Hebrew words, likeness and image used, we are made to be like God. And therefore, it isn't just that we have these godlike capacities, derivative capacities, if you like, to rule, to have dominion. It is that we have a specialness about us, which of course gives to every human being specialness. And interestingly, back in the middle of the 20th century, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I think is one of the 2 or 3 most consequent documents in the modern world, in a purely secular frame of reference, captures, if you like, the deposit of this Christian vision of the unique significance of every individual made in the image of God. But of course, for Christians, it is not simply creation. It is also incarnation. In that what we believe isn't just that God made us in his image, it is that he then took human form himself. And of course, these ideas do sort of plug together. He made us in his image, and therefore he was able to take human form in Jesus Christ and live a life as one of us. Now, I think a lot of Christians don't realize that didn't mean that then he rose and ascended and sort of the experiment was done. Perhaps the single most neglected Orthodox Christian belief is the doctrine of the continuing humanity of Jesus Christ. So Charles Wesley, I love Wesley partly because he was very much the hymn writer of the humanity of Christ. Wesley writes, "Of our flesh and of our bone, Jesus is our brother now." And Charles Hodge, since we're speaking Presbyterian, Charles Hodge, the greatest Reformed theologian America produced in the 19th century, in his systematic theology, puts it really rather well. He says, "The one who sits on the throne of the universe is both perfect man and perfect God." So, humans made in the image of God, given this dominion responsibility, and believing that God himself has taken human form in the ascended, exalted Christ to the throne of heaven itself. And that it is not simply that our humanness is some sort of epiphenomenon in the divine economy. It is fundamental not simply to us, but now even to God. Now, implications of that for other intelligences? Oh my goodness. These are questions which we're going to be wrestling with as we move forward. But as the sort of basic, fundamental sort of points of departure are actually very clear on what this means. And this is where I'll try to wrap this up. What this seems to me to mean is that Christians need to be the true humanists. This human thing. Humanism, of course, a term picked up by secularists to try to push back against religious people in a way which I think is pretty dishonest, because that's not historically how the term was used. Humanism essentially is a grasp of the significance of what within the Western tradition has been the human flourishing of the divine spirit. And as we manage all of these technology questions, we need to insist that technology is a subset of anthropology. This is part of the human project. These are tools for humans. And the human framing of this discussion must be at its heart. And we must look at these technologies, and I, as someone who greatly enjoys employing these technologies, we must always look at them within the frame of reference of the enhancement of human flourishing and the building of a human future. I mean, Parche, people like Kurzweil and others, wetware is not this inferior entity. We prefer hardware and software. Wetware, to use that rather disparaging term, It was wetware that was created in the image of God. It was wetware that was taken by God to himself in Jesus Christ. It is wetware which now is on the throne of glory in the raised, glorified Jesus Christ as God's Son. And this is the frame of reference within which every one of these technology developments should be assessed. And to that end, we can, I think, have some non-naive optimism that they will serve the human good in our time and perhaps in many times to come. As those who have dominion remember that we're made in the image of God, and therefore the human question is the question which is central. Thank you very much.